Alright, so you're looking at the bottom of this thing just for some context. Now, the four main supports that this display stand relies on are going to be here, 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 and here. Now, I can bring you in on a bit more of an angle to see that there is like a raised bit, and that's what really allows the stand to wedge itself into the bottom of this without, of course, being attached in any way. So this should just help with a bit of context, but I think it'll be best explained and best understood on pen and paper, so we'll go there now. So the first thing I had to consider was, since I wanted to display this on an angle, I would need some way to make sure that the stand was fixed onto the Millennium Falcon without actually being attached to it, because of course I don't want to just glue the stand to the Lego pieces. I want it to be free. Now, right here, 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 and here are those support areas that I just showed you in the last clip. So the first step I had to take was taking some measurements to see the sizes of the pieces I was going to need to use. So here were the measurements I was working with. Now you can see here we have 4 centimeters by 4.8 centimeters of space to work with to wedge a piece in there. And for the lower portions, which are symmetrical on both sides, we have about 1.5 centimeters of depth and that same 4 centimeters of width. So that's about the amount of space we have to wedge something in there. Now, the most important measurement is actually this 9.6 centimeters of distance between this top line and this top line. And I'm going to explain to you why that's the most important measurement. Let's look at this from another angle. Now, this is what it would look like if you were looking straight in from the side of the ship. Now, these two thicker parts are the support areas where we want to wedge our pieces of wood, in this case, to make the stand. Now, the distance that we were talking about is this, the top part of where this piece will go and the top part of where this piece will go. So ideally, we'll have a wedge here, a wedge here, and they'll be connected in some way to form the stand. The general shape that we're going for is something like this, that will then wedge itself in these two gaps. Now, the reason it's so important for this and this edge to be exactly the right distance, in our case 9.6 centimeters apart, is because consider another scenario here where this is wedged in perfectly, but this distance is too great, let's say 9.8 centimeters. The second support will fall right about here and will ultimately be doing nothing because it's not wedged in that area. Similarly, if we had made the distance too short, then it would fall up short and wouldn't wedge itself in at all. So that's why it's a really important measurement that we're going to take into consideration when we start putting this piece together. Now, something that's going to become important is the fact that my original measurements were a bit off, and I actually have about 1.9 centimeters of clearance here, and that's just going to make changes to the next set of measurements you're going to see. So this is the general design of the support pieces that I'm going to be going for, and of course I'm going to need 2 of these. Now, the most important factor is how I arrived at this 11.5 centimeter size for this main piece. Now, you can see here that the size of this block we can approximate around 4.5 centimeters. This doesn't have to be perfect because we know that the support piece is going to be this top edge. So that's what's important. If it is flush with this piece of wood, then we know exactly where it's going to be no matter what. Yet this block, we need to be exactly 1.9 centimeters. Now, the reason for that is if we line this up flush with this piece, then if this block is too big, then this edge, which we know is going to be a support edge, is going to be too high up. And if this piece is 1.8 or 1.7 centimeters, it's going to fall a little short. And we know that the most important measurement is this edge to this top edge, being 9.6. So, knowing that this piece is 1.9 centimeters and we need 9.6 centimeters between, then that arrives at 11.5 centimeters for the total length of this, and then we know we can just fit our pieces flush. Now that we have our measurements mapped out and we kind of understand why we're doing what we're doing, here's a couple of photos of the progress that I made and the process of putting these pieces together. So before we move on, you'll see from this photo that I fit the two support pieces we created into the back of the ship to make sure they fit perfectly, and then I glued a board across them to make sure that they wouldn't move and they'd always be the perfect distance apart, so I know no matter what I do to them, they'll fit perfectly into the back of the ship. So getting those support pieces to fit perfect is most of the difficult part, but now we have to consider the angled pieces that will keep this support system up. So of course, they're going to look something like this as my marker dies. And the important part to consider is this angle. Now, of course, this angle is going to determine the angle of your stand, or the angle of the thing that is on top of your stand. Obviously, if you make this steeper, then your display is going to sit more vertical. And if you make this shallow, then it'll sit almost flat like a table. Once you determine the angle that you want your model to sit at, it's of course got to be placed under here, and it'll be attached, this surface to this angled surface. Now, something else that's very important to consider is kind of the center of mass of the thing that you're going to be putting on the stand. And the reason behind that is, if your object is sitting up here and it's very top heavy, then you might want to move this stand up a little bit, this support bar, sorry, to support directly under the center of mass. If it's very front heavy, it could fall forward and you'd want to move this angled piece back a bit. So kind of play around with it, hold it in your hand so you can feel kind of whether it's going to tilt backwards or forwards when it's on this angle, and then you'll be able to make sure it'll be very secure once it's all together. With the angle figured out and the height of the bar that you want figured out, you can cut those pieces out, and here's a photo to show you what mine looked like. And now they were ready to just attach to the support piece. So all of this was done using just simply wood glue. I didn't use any nails or screws or anything. The wood glue was definitely strong enough bond. So once those were all connected, it looked like this. And that was almost 90% of the stand done. Now remember that big back piece was just used to make sure the spacing was perfect and that everything would fit together. It was originally going to be temporary, but I just left it on because you can't really see it. Now, once I stuck that whole assembly onto a fancy base plate, it was pretty much done. Now, I'll reiterate that the most important part of any stand is that you're going to make sure the support pieces that are going to wedge themselves into whatever you're displaying, you got to make sure they're in the perfect location so that you can actually support whatever you're trying to support properly. Now, also, the angled support pieces, you really have to make sure that those are directly under kind of the center of mass of whatever you're trying to display, because if they're not, then you risk your thing falling forwards or backwards, and that's bad because it's a stand and things should stand on it, they shouldn't fall off. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you learned something. I appreciate you checking this out, and now I'm just going to show you a couple clips of my final product.